They called me a disappointment for most of my life. Meanwhile, my brother Caleb got a brand new Porsche and the keys to a $110 million company. But what they didn't know was that in my drawer I had a sealed envelope from my grandfather. And the moment I opened it, everything they thought they knew shattered. I still remember the way they looked at him, like he was made of gold, like he could do no wrong. Caleb Whitman, the firstborn, the chosen one, 3 years older than me, taller, louder, always walking into a room like he owned it. And me, I was just Noah, the afterthought, the quiet one, the mistake they didn't plan for. We grew up in a 3-story colonial in Kirkland, just east of Seattle. My father, Edward Whitman, built our family's wealth from a real estate empire that stretched from Washington down to Southern California. Our last name carried weight, especially in places where property meant power. By the time I was old enough to understand status, Caleb had already been branded the heir. I used to watch him from the top of the stairs during the parties our parents threw every quarter. He'd glide through the crowd, whiskey in hand, charming investors with the same ease he teased me at breakfast. Our mother, Caroline, would fix his tie, laugh at his jokes, and whisper things like, "You're going to make this family proud." When I got good grades or quietly helped around the house, the most I got was a nod or a distracted smile. Tonight was no different. The late spring air carried the scent of jasmine and expensive cigars as I stood near the back patio of our family estate. Caleb had just arrived in his new Porsche Taycan charcoal gray with custom rims, revving the engine a few extra times so everyone turned their heads. Dad stood on the front steps with a glass of scotch, clapping like a proud coach welcoming his MVP. "Nice ride, son," he called out. Caleb grinned, sliding out of the driver's seat in his tailored navy suit. "It's just a toy, Dad. Wait till you see what I've got lined up for Q4. They laughed. People laughed. And I stood behind a marble column near the back doors, sipping something bitter and lukewarm. I wasn't even sure who poured it for me. Inside, the party was already in full swing. There were no streamers, no decorations, just high ceilings, soft jazz, and servers in black and white. Weaving through the crowd with trays of oysters and champagne. It was the Whitman way. Understated wealth, nothing too flashy. Except for Caleb. He was always the exception. I stepped into the kitchen to avoid the noise. Maria, our longtime cook, smiled when she saw me. "You hiding again, Noah?" "Just taking a breath," I said. She handed me a small plate of seared scallops and winked. "Don't let them forget you're part of this family." I gave her a half smile, walked back out, and found a spot near the bar where the lights were dimmer. That's when Dad tapped his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. It's not every day we get to celebrate success, growth, and the future in one evening. I want to take a moment to recognize someone very special." He turned to Caleb, who looked modest for once. Or at least pretended to. My son Caleb Whitman will officially begin his transition into the role of CEO of Whitman Holdings starting next fiscal year. It's been a long time coming, and I couldn't be more proud. Applause. Whistles. Some clapped out of politeness, some out of obligation, but most clapped because they believed it made sense. Caleb had been groomed for this his entire life. I wasn't surprised. I was just tired. Caleb raised his glass. "Thank you, everyone. I couldn't have done this without my father's guidance, my mother's support, and of course my incredible team. It's an honor to carry the torch. And don't worry, I'll keep the Porsche off the books." Laughter rippled through the room. I turned to leave, slipping through the side hall toward the old library where no one ever went during these parties. The wooden floors creaked under my shoes and the silence felt like an old friend. There above the fireplace hung a photo of Harold Whitman, my grandfather. He founded the company with nothing but grit in a single duplex in Tacoma back in the 70s. He used to call me Little H, said I reminded him of himself. I used to believe him. I sat down on the old leather couch, the drink now warm in my hand. Caleb was going to inherit the empire. I was going to inherit what? A few polite smiles in a corner office no one cared about. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the edges of the envelope. Still sealed, still heavy. Harold had given it to me before he passed, told me not to open it until the time felt right, said it would answer the questions I didn't even know I was carrying. Maybe tonight was the beginning of that answer. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of celebration through the walls. They were celebrating Caleb. Again, always, but something inside me had shifted, not anger, not jealousy, just clarity. A stillness that told me the story wasn't over. Not yet. I closed my eyes and waited. The sound of a door closing somewhere down the hall snapped me back. I opened my eyes and stared at the envelope in my lap. My fingers traced the edges, worn and soft now, like it had aged with me. I had carried it through cities, apartments, job interviews, and heartbreaks. I had never dared open it, not because I was afraid of what it said. I was afraid it might say nothing at all. Back in 2012, I was working as a junior financial analyst at Whitman Holdings. I was 2 years out of business school, too eager maybe. I put in long hours, triple-checked every report, even took on weekend assignments that Caleb passed off. I thought if I worked hard enough they'd see me. Not just see me in the room, but really see me. Then the numbers didn't add up. It started with a routine audit, minor discrepancies, a few invoices that didn't match. I was pulled into a conference room with 2 board members, my father and a corporate attorney. The air was cold. My father didn't look at me when he spoke. "We're going to ask for your resignation, Noah, effective immediately." I couldn't speak. I felt like I had left my body. The attorney handed me a folder. There was a paper trail I had never seen before. Allocations I didn't approve, budgets I didn't touch. But every file had my digital signature. Later, I learned Caleb had access to my login. Our IT manager, a guy named Jeremy, hinted at it during drinks a few weeks after I left. He didn't say it directly, just that Caleb liked shortcuts and I should watch my back. By then, it was too late. They let me go without press, quietly, to avoid embarrassing the family. But people noticed. At networking events, I was no longer Noah Whitman from Whitman Holdings. I was just Noah, unemployed, disposable. That fall, I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Bellevue and started freelancing. Nothing serious. Financial reviews for startups, budget projections for nonprofits. I couldn't bring myself to apply for another firm job. My resume was stained and I didn't have the fight in me to explain. The only person who reached out from the family was Grandpa Harold. He called me 2 weeks after everything fell apart and asked me to meet him at his house on Lake Sammamish. The drive was quiet. I remember the way the leaves had turned that year. Everything gold and brittle. When I arrived, he was sitting in his usual chair by the window sipping black coffee, no sugar, same as always. He didn't ask me how I was. He didn't need to. They turned on you real quick, didn't they? I nodded. My voice didn't work right then. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit, Noah. There's something I need you to understand." He talked for nearly an hour. About business loyalty and the way blood didn't always mean trust. He never said Caleb's name. He didn't have to. I built Whitman Holdings because I wanted to protect this family. But somewhere along the way, we stopped building anything. Your father got too used to winning. Caleb, well, he got too used to applause. I stayed quiet, listening. It was the first time someone in my family had spoken to me like an adult in months. He reached into the drawer of a small wooden box and pulled out the envelope. He held it between both hands like it was sacred. "This isn't a gift," he said. "It's a correction. But don't open it until I'm gone. If you never feel like you need it, throw it away." I nodded, unsure. He leaned forward and his eyes, always sharper than his words, locked onto mine. "And don't ever doubt who you are again. You remind me of who I was before all this." He died 3 months later. There was a memorial. There were flowers, eulogies, long speeches about legacy. Caleb cried in front of the cameras. My father gave a toast. I stood at the back next to the valet booth. No one mentioned the envelope. 10 years. I had kept it sealed, hidden behind books, locked in drawers, under socks, then back in coat pockets. Sometimes I forgot it was there. But every time Caleb's name came up in business news, when he was praised in Forbes or featured in Real Estate Digest, I'd feel the envelope burning against my skin again. What if Harold had left something real? A document, a message, a map out of this shadow. The video part bothered me most. He had recorded something and I had never watched it. I didn't even know what format. Maybe it was on a flash drive or maybe an old SD card. He was old-fashioned that way. That night after the party, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the envelope on the nightstand beside me. I could hear Caleb's voice in my head. The smug laugh, the way he called me little brother with a tone that always meant less than. In the morning, I made coffee, sat down at my kitchen table and pulled the envelope in front of me. My hands hovered. Maybe it was time, but I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I opened my laptop and typed in a name I hadn't searched in years. Rachel Morrison. It was time to find someone who knew the law better than my father's team ever would. Someone who didn't owe the Whitmans anything. Someone who might believe me. I sent her a message. 5 minutes later, she replied, "When do you want to meet?" I looked at the envelope again. "Tomorrow," I wrote. "I'll bring something with me, something important." The Whitman summer gathering was always excessive. Every July, the estate lawn would be transformed into a sprawling maze of white tents, string lights, and enough catered food to feed a small country. Guests arrived in linen suits and designer dresses. Valet drivers lined up luxury cars along the gated drive, and someone always brought a string quartet even when no one asked for one. It was tradition. Hollow and overdone. That year, 2020, I had planned to skip it. The world was unraveling, and I didn't have the patience to stomach another evening of Caleb parading around like a prince. But Caroline, our mother, called 2 days before the event and asked me to come. She said my absence would be noticed. She meant it would be a problem, so I agreed. I arrived late on purpose. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the lawn. Waiters floated past with trays of champagne, and a jazz trio played something slow and meaningless near the back patio. I made my way through familiar faces who barely looked at me, and poured myself a whiskey from the self-serve bar. Then I saw her. Amy Sanders. Long blonde hair, effortless posture, the kind of smile that had already calculated how much she was worth in the room. Caleb was at her side, hand on her back like he was showing off a new trophy. He spotted me and lit up with that grin he reserved for when he felt especially pleased with himself. "Noah Whitman," he called out loud enough to turn heads. "I was starting to think you'd finally cut ties. Nice of you to prove me wrong." I gave him a nod, kept my expression flat. "Caleb," I said. He stepped forward and threw an arm around my shoulder. Amy hung back slightly, sipping her drink and watching. He leaned in. "Still working those non-profit gigs? Heard you're saving the world one spreadsheet at a time." I stepped out of his grip. Still charming as ever, huh? Amy laughed politely. Caroline appeared then gently taking Amy's hand. Amy, sweetheart, come meet the rest of the family. Robert's by the fountain. Amy excused herself with a smile and followed our mother. Caleb stayed swirling his drink. You know, I always wondered what it must feel like, he said, to be in a room full of people who only talk to you because they pity you. I didn't answer. He thrived on reactions. The less I gave, the more he pushed. He chuckled. Don't worry. We all know you're doing your best. Some people just aren't built for pressure. Or success. There it was, the bait, the dig, the smug tilt of his head that reminded me why I used to hate sharing a bathroom with him as a kid. Robert walked over, catching the last of it. Everything good here, he asked, more out of form than concern. Caleb smiled. Just reminiscing? Noah was telling me about his latest volunteer gig. Robert didn't smile. He glanced at me, then back to his drink. You should know your place, Noah. It'll make these things easier. Then he turned and walked away. That was it. That was the moment something inside me snapped. It wasn't dramatic or loud. Just a quiet shift. A silence that stretched deeper than the usual dull ache. I had spent my whole life walking on eggshells around Caleb, around our father, around the Whitman name. But I wasn't 12 anymore. I wasn't a scared college grad trying to fit in where I didn't belong. I had been cheated, lied about, cast aside, and I had let it happen. No more. I left the party without saying goodbye, drove straight back to my apartment, the hum of Caleb's laughter still ringing in my ears. I didn't sleep. Instead, I pulled out an old storage box from my closet. Inside were papers, photos, a few USB drives. All the remnants I had gathered in silence over the years. I hadn't looked through them in ages. I laid them out on the floor one by one. Corporate emails from my Whitman Holdings account. Expense reports that didn't match. Photos of my grandfather from the year before he died sitting with me on that same patio where Caleb had just humiliated me. And the envelope, still sealed. I picked it up, ran my thumb along the edge, then set it back down. Morning came like a slap, bright and loud. Rachel met me at a cafe in downtown Bellevue. She looked the same as I remembered. Sharp, no nonsense. A gray blazer over a black tee, sunglasses tucked into her hair. You look tired, she said, sliding into the booth. Family reunion, I muttered. She raised an eyebrow. That bad, worse. I pulled the envelope from my coat and laid it on the table. He gave me this before he died. Said it would answer questions I hadn't asked yet. She picked it up, gently turned it over in her hands. You haven't opened it? Not yet. Why now? Because I'm done being silent, she nodded. Okay, but if what's in here is what I think it might be, we're going to need more than just paper. We'll need records, evidence, something solid. I have more. Some emails, expense trails, and there's something weird in the company filings from 2011. Caleb's name pops up on budgets that were approved under mine. I never signed those. Rachel leaned back. You think he set you up? I know he did. She tapped the envelope once. Let's find out if your grandfather knew it too. I looked at her steady now for the first time in years. Let's. Rachel slid the envelope into her leather case like it was evidence in a murder trial. She didn't say anything for a minute, just looked at me across the table like she was weighing something. I could see the gears turning in her head. That's what I remembered most about her in college. Always 3 moves ahead. We need to be smart about this, she said. If this envelope contains what I think it might, an updated notarized will and some form of evidence about Caleb's paternity, it changes everything. How much can it change legally? A lot. If Caleb isn't your father's biological son and your grandfather's will excludes him, then yes, you would have a legitimate claim to both the estate and the company. But we need to be sure, I exhaled slowly. I had imagined this moment for years, some version of it anyway, but hearing it said out loud in legal terms made it feel real in a way I hadn't prepared for. Rachel continued, "The first thing we need to do is verify what's actually in that envelope. When you're ready, we'll open it together." Not here, though. At my office, with documentation and a camera rolling, and if it's valid, then we go deeper. We investigate Caleb's birth records, his legal status, and any evidence that shows he may not be Robert's biological son. If Susan had an affair, or if there was some kind of donor involved, that's the thread we pull. Wouldn't that kind of thing be sealed? Some of it, yes. But medical records from back then were often less protected. If Susan was treated at a private clinic or had insurance claims, there might be paper trails. What about Caleb's own records? We won't get them directly. Not without a subpoena. But there are ways to triangulate. School records, vaccination cards, old pediatricians. If we're lucky, even a birth certificate might give us something unusual. We're not going to break the law, but we'll push as far as it legally bends. I nodded. I could feel my pulse behind my eyes. My mouth was dry. So what do you need from me? Names, dates, places, anything you remember. The more context I have, the more I can search. Also, we need to keep this quiet. If Caleb or Robert catch wind of what we're doing, they'll bury everything before we get close. You think they'd actually destroy evidence? She gave me a look that said I already knew the answer. "I'll start with Susan," she said. "Her medical history is the weakest point in the armor. If she saw a fertility specialist or had complications, that'll be where it starts." We parted ways with a plan to meet in 2 days. I went home and pulled out an old shoebox full of family photos. Birthdays, holidays, vacations. I wasn't looking for nostalgia. I was looking for patterns. Who was present? Who wasn't? Faces that repeated or disappeared. One picture stood out, Caleb's 6th birthday. He was grinning, frosting on his nose, surrounded by classmates. Our mother stood behind him, arms crossed, but Robert wasn't in the photo. I flipped it over. The date was August 1988. That summer, I remembered Robert had been out of town for nearly 2 months overseeing a commercial development in Arizona. The math hit me all at once. If Caleb was born in March of 1983, and Robert was away 9 months before that, something didn't line up. I texted Rachel the photo. 10 minutes later, she called. This is something she said. "If Robert was gone that long and there's any medical record of Susan having prenatal care during that period without his name on the file, it gives us a reason to question paternity. And if the will says Caleb's not a legal heir, then you don't just have a claim, you have a case." The next morning, I met her at her firm's office in downtown Seattle. It was a glass tower that looked like money and smelled like ambition. Rachel walked me into a private conference room with frosted doors and a locked file cabinet. We sat across from each other. She placed a voice recorder on the table and clicked it on. Date August 2, 2023. This is Rachel Morrison, attorney of record, joined by client Noah Whitman. Opening sealed envelope provided by decedent Harold Whitman. She handed it to me. My fingers hesitated, then tore gently along the seal. Inside was a set of documents. On top, a notarized will dated January 5, 2012. The name Caleb Whitman was missing, replaced with language naming Noah Whitman as sole inheritor of Harold Whitman's estate and voting power in Whitman Holdings. Rachel's eyes scanned the text rapidly. She stopped when she reached a line halfway down the page. "This is it," she whispered. "This clause removes Caleb based on non-blood relation, and it's backed by a notarized affidavit from Harold himself, He knew. There was also a flash drive. I plugged it into Rachel's laptop. A video opened, grainy but clear. My grandfather sitting in the same chair by the lake, looking older than I remembered, but just as sharp. If you're watching this, Noah, then I'm gone. And if I'm gone, it's time you knew the truth. Your father made mistakes. Your brother is not your brother by blood. Susan had an affair in 1982. Robert knew. He chose to raise Caleb anyway for appearances. I kept the secret too long. This company was built on trust, and I will not let it be inherited by someone it was never meant for. Rachel paused the video. We have everything. I sat back in the chair. The silence in the room was heavier than any courtroom. What now, I asked. Now, she said, we move carefully, and we build the case that's going to bring them down. The King County Vital Records Office was tucked between a courthouse annex and a nondescript post office in downtown Seattle. It was the kind of building no one noticed unless they had to. I stood in line behind a man arguing about his passport photo, a young mother with a stroller, and someone applying for a marriage license. My reason for being there felt like it didn't belong in the same room. When I reached the counter, the clerk looked over his glasses. Name Caleb Whitman, born March 14th, 1983. I need a copy of his birth certificate. Are you an immediate family member? I hesitated. I'm his brother. That got me a slight squint. He clicked through a few screens. You're listed on his file. No, I don't think so. He raised an eyebrow, tapped something, then printed a form. Fill this out. There's a fee. We'll check if access is allowed under state record policy. I filled it in with shaking hands. 30 minutes later, I was sitting in the lobby, flipping through the thin official paper. Most of it was standard: name, date, hospital. But under father, the line was blank. No name, no signature, just an empty space where Robert Whitman should have been. I drove straight to Rachel's office and slid the document across her desk. She read it in silence, jaw tight. No legal father listed, she said quietly. That's a huge gap. Combine this with the will and the video, it's starting to form a pretty strong foundation. I paced. If he was never legally Robert's son, then technically he wasn't a legal heir, right? It depends. In some states, long-term acknowledgement and cohabitation can establish paternity. But in Washington, if there's no listed father and no adoption paperwork, it weakens his claim. Especially when we have a will that specifically disinherits him. What about DNA? That's our strongest move if we can get a sample. Do you have anything of his hair toothbrush? Even an old hat, I thought for a second. He left a gym bag at my apartment once years ago. Might still be in my storage unit. If we can test you both and prove you're not biological siblings, it strengthens the argument. But we also prep in case we don't get that far. Legally, the will is king if it's valid and unchallenged. Later that night, I went back to my old storage unit in Kirkland. Dust everywhere. I hadn't opened it in years. It smelled like mold and cardboard. I dug through boxes of books, furniture, old winter coats. Then I found the bag. Black nylon frayed zipper. Still had a water bottle inside, protein bars long expired, and a baseball cap with sweat stains around the brim. I called Rachel the next morning. I have something. Probably hair, maybe sweat. She told me to drop it at a private lab downtown. No names. Cash only. They would run a sibling DNA test using my own sample and whatever was on the hat. Results in 10 days. In the meantime, we kept digging. Rachel contacted a retired legal clerk who used to work probate cases in the 80s. He remembered Harold, said the man was meticulous, always formal, never missed a signature. When Rachel asked if Harold had ever discussed succession plans, the clerk said yes, but only once. He came in the week before New Year's 2012 and asked how to make a will airtight against challenge. Said he wanted to make sure someone didn't inherit something they weren't entitled to. Wouldn't say who. Just kept calling it cleaning the bloodline. Rachel called me as soon as she hung up. He knew Noah, and he made moves to protect the company from Caleb. I asked what came next. She said we needed more historical proof. Something in writing, a motive, a record that connected Susan to someone else around the time Caleb would have been conceived. I spent the weekend back at the lake house. It had been empty since Harold passed. Our family kept it as a rental, but no one had stayed there in over a year. The walls still smelled like cedar. The furniture hadn't moved since the last time I saw him. I went upstairs to his study. The desk drawers were locked. I found the key taped under the lamp. Inside was a series of leather-bound journals handwritten in blue ink dated from 1979 through 2012. I flipped through the pages slowly, carefully. Most of it was business notes, meetings, mergers, quotes about legacy. But one entry from July 1982 stopped me cold. She's been distant lately, spends a lot of time at the gallery. Robert hasn't noticed, but I have. She came home once smelling like someone else's cologne. If the rumors are true and the child isn't his, we will have to decide what family means. Another entry from April 1983. I saw the boy today. He looks nothing like Robert. Susan says he has her father's nose. Maybe. Or maybe she's lying to herself too. Either way, I'll keep the peace, but not forever. I photocopied the entries and sent them to Rachel. "This is gold," she replied. "Journals are admissible if verified, and this directly questions paternity from the man who built the company." I sat on the porch and watched the lake ripple under the wind. The DNA might still be inconclusive. Maybe the hat didn't have enough material. Maybe it would be tossed out in court, but these words were from a man who built an empire, and he knew it was being stolen from the inside. So did I. The ballroom at the Fairmont Olympic shimmered like a set piece from a movie. Gold lighting, polished marble floors, and crystal chandeliers dripping like icicles over a sea of black tuxedos and sequined gowns. The $75 million empire my grandfather built was now celebrating 4 decades of success in front of 200 guests and a dozen reporters. I stood near the back watching them all. A banner stretched across the stage read, "Whitman Group, 40 Years of Vision." I had stared at those same words on the company letterhead once before they erased my name from everything but the HR archives. Caleb made his entrance 20 minutes after the event began, always late enough to be noticed. He wore a custom charcoal suit with a navy tie flanked by Amy on one side and a junior executive I didn't recognize on the other. Photographers turned. The room shifted. That smug signature smirk was already in place as he shook hands, kissed cheeks, posed for cameras like he was born into spotlight. My mother hovered nearby, beaming. Robert stood at the foot of the stage, sipping something neat and watching Caleb like a man watching his own legacy unfold. I hadn't spoken to either of them in weeks. Rachel had warned me. If I did this tonight, there would be no going back. No family dinners, no polite apologies, no retreat. I told her I didn't want any of that anyway. Caleb took the stage just as dessert was being cleared. The lights dimmed. The jazz trio stopped playing. All eyes turned to the podium. He adjusted the microphone and gave the room a wide, gracious smile. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here to celebrate this incredible milestone with us. 40 years ago, Harold Whitman bought a duplex in Tacoma with everything he had in his savings account. Today, Whitman Group spans 3 states, 12 development zones, and over $3 billion in assets under management." Polite applause. Robert nodded from his table. I'm honored Caleb continued to represent the next generation of Whitman leadership. This company isn't just a business, it's a family, it's history, and I promise to carry it forward with the same integrity and drive my grandfather exemplified. I clenched my jaw. Integrity. That word tasted like ash coming from his mouth. He raised his glass to Harold Whitman and to the future. The room echoed his words, glasses clinked. Robert stepped up next, his voice slower, more deliberate. Some of you have watched Caleb grow up in boardrooms on job sites beside me in every major decision we've made. He's earned this. Starting next fiscal year, he will officially transition into the role of CEO. I trust him, I believe in him, and I know Harold would too. More applause, louder this time. I reached into my coat and gripped the envelope. 10 years it had sat unopened, 10 years of silence waiting. I felt its weight in my hand like a judge's gavel. Tonight it would finally speak. I moved closer to the stage, quiet and steady. Rachel stood near the media table, eyes locked on mine. We had rehearsed nothing. It had to feel natural, controlled. But I saw the tension in her shoulders. Robert had just stepped down, Caleb's hand now resting on the podium like he owned it. Before we wrap this up, he said, I want to thank one more person, my brother Noah. He's here tonight. Some of you know we've had our differences, but I've always admired his quiet resilience. Maybe we'll even find him a desk in the new office. Laughter, thin and forced. My mother smiled like someone watching a tightrope act. I stepped forward. The room hushed just slightly. Not silence, but anticipation. I didn't need a mic. Actually, I do have something to share. Caleb turned. Surprise flickered, then faded behind that carefully molded mask he wore so well. I pulled the envelope from my coat and placed it on the podium. This was given to me by Harold Whitman in 2012, shortly before he passed. He asked me not to open it until the time was right. Rachel moved forward, handing a flash drive to the AV technician. I heard murmurs from the audience, a few confused glances. The screens behind the stage flickered to life. I opened the envelope, slowly removed the documents, and held them up. This is a notarized will, signed and witnessed. Dated January 5th, 2012. It names me, Noah Whitman, as the sole legal heir to the Whitman estate and holdings. Robert stood. My mother paled. Caleb didn't move. The screen brightened. Harold's face appeared. His voice filled the room. If you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and it means the truth needs to be heard. Gasps. Silence. I stepped back, letting my grandfather speak. I didn't need to say anything more. Not yet. The truth was already unraveling in front of them. All I had to do was watch. The air inside the ballroom turned still, as if everyone had forgotten how to breathe. The screen behind the stage showed my grandfather sitting in his favorite armchair, the lake behind him glinting in late afternoon light. His voice was calm, deliberate, and carried a weight no one could ignore. If you're watching this, then I've passed. And if you're watching this, it means I've finally chosen to reveal the truth I've held back far too long. I saw Robert shift in his seat, his jaw clenched tight. My mother covered her mouth, eyes wide with a dread that had no place to hide. Caleb stood frozen beside the podium, his hand still resting where I had set the envelope down. I am not proud of the secrets our family has kept, Harold continued. But I will not let a lie inherit what I built. Caleb is not my blood, he is not Robert's son. Years ago, Susan had an affair. I kept the peace for the sake of appearances, for the sake of my son. But the time for silence has passed. Gasps echoed across the room. Someone dropped a wine glass. The sound of shattering crystal seemed to punctuate every word my grandfather said. My will, which you will find in the possession of Noah Whitman, names him as the sole legal heir to my estate, including all voting shares in Whitman Group and full authority over succession planning. He is my grandson. He is the one who carries my name, my values, and my legacy. Caleb's voice finally broke through the noise. This is a setup, he snapped. That video could be fake. You can't just roll in here. And Rachel stepped forward, holding the original documents. Her badge clipped to her blazer was now visible to everyone. I'm Rachel Morrison, legal counsel to Mr. Noah Whitman. This video was recorded and notarized in January 2012. The will was signed, witnessed, and filed in accordance with the revised Code of Washington. If you would like to contest its authenticity, we welcome the opportunity to present DNA findings and supporting affidavits in court. Robert stood, his face burning red. This is outrageous. We already filed Harold's last will after his death. That document was never submitted. Rachel didn't flinch. That's because your submission was outdated. Harold executed a newer will which supersedes the one filed. Under state law, a more recent valid will voids any prior versions. We'll be delivering this document to probate court first thing Monday morning. The room descended into murmurs, half whispers, half arguments. One of the board members stood up and asked to see the will. Another demanded to know if Caleb's shares were affected. A third was already on his phone, likely calling an attorney. Caleb turned to me, eyes wild. You've been planning this. I didn't look away. No, I've been holding it. For 10 years, you just kept giving me more reasons to finally open it. Amy stepped back, distancing herself without saying a word. My mother looked at me with tears in her eyes. But I couldn't tell if they were from guilt or humiliation. Maybe both. Robert tried one last time. Do you really want to tear this family apart over money? I walked to the microphone. My hands didn't shake. This isn't about money. This is about truth, about the man who gave me a second chance when none of you would, about the legacy of someone who built this company with his bare hands and refused to let it be hijacked by a lie. The room fell quiet again. Even the chandeliers seemed to dim. I held the envelope in the air one last time. This piece of paper sat in my drawer for over a decade. I waited. I gave you all time. And you never once asked why. You never once looked at me like I belonged. I stepped away from the mic. Rachel gathered the documents. The screen behind me faded to black. Someone clapped, just one, then two. Then a slow ripple of applause began to not everyone, but enough to let me know the tide had shifted. The truth was out, and there was no putting it back in the envelope. The ballroom emptied faster than I expected. The board members left in clusters, whispering with tight jaws and tighter eyes. Amy didn't say a word. She took one last look at Caleb and walked out. Her heels clicking across the marble floor like gavel strikes. Caleb didn't try to stop her. He just stood there, pale and trembling, rage simmering behind a face frozen in disbelief. My mother collapsed. Not theatrically. Just a slow, quiet folding into herself. Her glass slipped from her hand and shattered near her chair. Paramedics were called. The hotel manager brought a wheelchair. She didn't say anything to me when they rolled her out. Didn't look at me either. Caleb finally turned to me as the crowd thinned. You think this is over? I didn't answer. You think some video and an old man's paranoia is going to erase 30 years of my life? Still, I said nothing. He jabbed a finger toward Rachel. You'll regret this. Both of you. The following morning, Rachel and I met in her office, surrounded by boxes of old files and a new wall of media requests. Every news outlet in Seattle wanted the full story, some national ones too. They want an exclusive, she said, scrolling her inbox. They're calling this the Whitman bombshell. You ready for that? I wasn't. But I nodded anyway. The story ran in the Times that weekend. The article was blunt. Secret will, secret heir, secret paternity. No one used the word illegitimate, but it hung between every line. Caleb responded 2 days later through his attorney. David Prescott. I remembered the name. Former federal prosecutor turned private bulldog, a man who made headlines for dismantling tech giants and burying whistleblowers. Caleb had come to play hard. The countersuit arrived by courier. It alleged that the will was fraudulent, the video doctored, and that I had conspired with Rachel to falsify my grandfather's wishes. They even included a motion for a temporary injunction to freeze all corporate transfers. He's going scorched earth, Rachel said, thumbing through the pages. Can he win only if we let him? We filed our own response that day, accompanied by notarized affidavits, the DNA test, and a written statement from the retired legal clerk who had witnessed Harold signing the will. Rachel moved fast, filing a motion to validate the will under expedited review, citing public interest and financial urgency. In the meantime, Whitman Group stock dropped 8% in 3 days. The board postponed their quarterly strategy meeting. Investors were panicking. One called me personally, demanding to know if the leadership was stable. The thing no one wanted to admit out loud was this: the only reason Caleb had ever been considered legitimate was because no one had questioned him. Now everyone was. Robert avoided the press completely. No public statement, no private outreach. Just silence. But Susan unraveled. Rachel told me she'd been contacted by a mutual friend who had seen my mother at a pharmacy in Bellevue trembling so badly she couldn't sign her prescription. Another source told us she had canceled all social events for the next month. When I tried to call, it went straight to voicemail. I left a message anyway, just one line. I didn't do this to hurt you. I never got a response. Rachel worked around the clock building a timeline, collecting old HR documents from the company correspondence emails. Even birthday cards Harold had sent me as a child. We had a forensic expert authenticate the video. The USB had never been tampered with. The digital signature from the original recording device matched. Prescott fired back with his own forensic expert. Claimed inconsistencies in lighting and vocal cadence. It was a stretch, a loud one, but he knew what he was doing. The judge set a preliminary hearing for 2 weeks out. Enough time for discovery, enough time for the storm to grow teeth. I tried to sleep. I tried to eat. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's face going pale in that ballroom. I heard Caleb's voice in my head calling me a fraud, a thief, a snake. I told myself it was guilt, but part of it was fear, because once you pull the curtain back on the truth, you can't control what crawls out. Emma Blake, a well-known investigative journalist, published her article on a Monday morning. The headline was "Blunt Whitman heir accused of embezzlement and workplace misconduct." Within hours, it went viral. She cited anonymous sources, internal memos, and former employees willing to go on record. Caleb was accused of siphoning funds from a Shell subsidiary to finance a private real estate purchase in Bellevue. He had also allegedly fired a female employee shortly after she disclosed her pregnancy and enforced NDAs to silence whistleblowers. By noon, the Whitman Group board released a statement. They were calling an emergency meeting. Public pressure had grown too large to ignore. Reporters camped outside the corporate headquarters. Stock analysts revised their guidance. Board members were seen entering through the service entrances to avoid press. Rachel called me that afternoon. They're suspending Caleb pending investigation. He's no longer authorized to act on behalf of the company. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. But I felt something shift. Later that evening, Emma called me directly. She wanted a comment, said she had followed my story for weeks and admired my restraint. I thanked her for the journalism but declined the interview. I don't need to say anything else, I told her. The truth has already spoken. She understood. She didn't push, but before hanging up, she added one thing. They're digging deeper now. This won't stop with Caleb. I hung up and looked out my apartment window, watching Seattle's skyline glow under the pressure of its own scrutiny. The empire was cracking, and no one could predict where the next fault line would break. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not in temperature but in tone. Federal Court building in downtown Seattle carried a certain finality. The marble, the silence, the weight of things unsaid. Judge Karen Ellis took her seat just after 10. She was composed, gray-haired, deliberate. She didn't waste time with fanfare. She read through the ruling calmly, her voice even and firm. The last will and testament of Harold Whitman, dated and notarized in 2011, had met all the statutory requirements of the state of Washington. The accompanying video, authenticated by forensic experts, reinforced the testator's intent. The DNA results, while not necessary for legal standing, corroborated the lack of blood relation between Caleb Whitman and the Whitman family line. Therefore, the court recognized the last will as valid and binding. All assets, shares, and controlling interests of the Whitman Group were to be transferred to me immediately. Caleb had no legal claim. His petition was denied. The injunction was lifted. There was no applause, just silence. Caleb sat across from me in the courtroom, jaw clenched, his lawyer whispering something to him that he didn't hear or didn't care to. Rachel gave my hand a quiet squeeze. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt relief, a heavy, quiet release of breath I didn't know I had been holding for 12 years. Later that afternoon, I returned to the apartment alone. Rachel had meetings, the press was circling like vultures, and I needed quiet. I poured a drink, sat on the edge of the couch, and stared out the window. Rain was starting. There was a knock at the door, not loud, not urgent, just present. When I opened it, Susan stood there, no makeup. Rain clung to her coat, her eyes were red. "Can I come in?" I nodded, stepped aside. She sat on the same couch I had just left, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze somewhere far from here. I knew, she said before I could ask. I sat across from her, silent. "Back then when you were little, Harold tried to tell Robert, but he wouldn't hear it. Said Caleb was his son no matter what. And he made me promise. For the family. For the name." She was shaking. I hated myself for it. For every time I saw you, pushed aside and said nothing. I told myself I was protecting all of you. But I see now I was just protecting him and his pride. I leaned forward. She didn't look at me. Her fingers twisted around each other like they were tying invisible knots. "I'm sorry, Noah. I should have stood up for you. I should have told the truth. I should have been your mother." "You are," I said quietly. She looked up, her eyes wet, desperate not for forgiveness but for acknowledgement. I reached across the table and took her hand. "I don't hate you," I said. "I never did. I was angry, yes. Lost, but not because of you. Because no one ever told me why." She nodded. A tear slipped free. "I thought if I ignored it long enough it would all go away. The truth never goes away," I said. "It waits." She smiled, small, sad, but real. "Thank you," she whispered. We sat there for a long time. No words, just two people in the quiet. The storm outside getting heavier, and finally something inside me began to still. The first board meeting under my leadership started without ceremony. No champagne, no photographers, just a stack of restructuring documents and a room full of wary eyes. The same executives who had once looked through me now looked at me differently. Some with respect, some with fear, a few with silent relief. I dismissed the entire upper HR division within the first week. They had been Caleb's echo chamber for years, enabling silence-burying complaints and protecting his interests under the guise of corporate efficiency. I replaced them with a new team led by people who understood compassion as much as they understood compliance. The PR department sent me dozens of requests, interviews, documentaries, magazine features. Everyone wanted the inside story. I rejected them all. We're not a scandal. We're a company. We rebuild in silence, I told them. Robert resigned quietly, no farewell speech, no public statement. He left a handwritten letter in my office drawer. It said very little, mostly apologies that came too late. I didn't call him. Caleb disappeared. No lawsuits, no countersuits, no press appearances. His apartment in Capitol Hill was listed for sale within a month. Emma told me he had booked a one-way ticket to Argentina. I didn't ask for confirmation. I didn't care. Instead, I started something new. The Herald Foundation launched 6 weeks later. Its mission was simple: provide scholarships and mentorship to young adults who had been disowned, displaced, or abandoned by their families. We partnered with local shelters, colleges, and legal clinics. Rachel joined as a founding board member. Susan donated anonymously. I covered the rest. Our first recipient was a 19-year-old named Marcus. He'd been kicked out for coming out. He wanted to study mechanical engineering. He cried when we handed him the acceptance letter and grant. I shook his hand and told him something Harold once told me. You don't owe the world silence just because it's louder than you. The company stabilized by the end of the quarter. Stock recovered, clients returned, internal audits cleaned up the last of Caleb's mess. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up with a knot in my stomach. I kept my office simple. No portraits, no trophies, just a photo of Harold and me from a fishing trip when I was 10. We didn't catch anything that day, but I remembered feeling like I had everything. Rachel stopped by one afternoon with coffee. She looked around. You're not redecorating, I like the blank space, I said. Let's the new ideas breathe. She smiled. We sat for a while, talked about nothing urgent. I thought about all the versions of myself I had to kill to become the man sitting behind this desk. The silent son, the rejected heir, the forgotten brother. I buried them all and built something out of what remained. And as the city lights blinked on outside my window, I realized I no longer felt like I was waiting for something to go wrong. I was finally building something that might last. The sun was beginning to set behind Elliott Bay, casting long shadows across the harbor. From the top floor of the Whitman Group headquarters, I could see the ferries slicing across the water. The cranes along the docks silhouetted against the golden light. Seattle had never looked more like home. I stood by the window of my office, coffee untouched, hands in my pockets. For a long time I said nothing, just listened. The hum of the city below, the muted murmur of employees packing up for the day. It felt distant, quiet, earned. On the wall behind me hung nothing but a brass plaque with 6 words engraved: "Character is built, not inherited." Harold had said that once. He told me while we stood in a muddy field behind his old cabin in Wenatchee, digging out rotten fence posts and arguing about politics. I was 23, angry at the world, angry at Caleb, angry at him too sometimes, but he had looked at me that day with something rare in his eyes. Faith. You don't get to choose where you start, he said, but you damn sure choose where you end up. I turned from the window and walked slowly to the desk. Sat down. The new leather still creaked. A stack of reports waited for signatures, but I didn't pick up the pen. In the drawer to my left was the USB drive. I had watched the video of Harold's declaration only once more since the courtroom. Not because I doubted it, but because it wasn't what mattered anymore. The company was mine, legally, publicly, uncontested, but that wasn't the part that stayed with me. What lingered was the moment in court when no one spoke, when the room was still, when the truth was so loud it silenced everything else and what came after. Susan called every week now, sometimes to talk, sometimes just to hear my voice. We didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. But we also didn't let it define the future. There was something brave in her now, something free. I think she had spent too many years with secrets curled inside her ribs like smoke. Rachel and I stayed close, no labels, no expectations, just presence. She told me once that justice wasn't about winning. It was about being seen. That's what this was, visibility. After years in the shadow of someone else's performance, I had stepped into my own story and stayed there. Caleb never came back. Last I heard, he was living off what was left of a trust Harold had set aside when we were kids. A small, forgotten clause, enough to survive, not enough to reclaim anything. I didn't hate him. I didn't need to. He had built a life on a lie, and when the lie collapsed, so did the life. Mine had been built on something else. Pain, quiet endurance, the long, thankless work of trying again, of choosing to be decent even when no one's watching. The foundation was expanding. We'd signed new partnerships in Portland, San Diego, and Albuquerque. Young people were walking through our doors with bruised pasts and hopeful eyes. I met each one like I had met Marcus, with respect, with a promise. You're not where you came from. As the sky dimmed, I stood again and walked back to the window. The lights of the city flickered on one by one, tiny rebellions against the dark. Behind me, the office was quiet. Ahead of me, the bay was endless. I remembered Harold's voice like it was yesterday. Value doesn't come from where you're born, it comes from how you live. And for the first time in my life, I felt the full truth of that.